Welcome to Room Award, the podcast that explores the secrets of sleep and psychology. I'm your host, Ryan, and in each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of sleep and other topics such as mental well-being and personal growth. If you want to unlock your full potential and receive the rewards that come with understanding the power of sleep, you're in the right place. To discover more tips and insights on improving your sleep and overall well-being, visit our website and explore our other episodes at roomaward.org. Hey everyone, today we're joined with Dr. Jessica Hamilton. She's an assistant professor at Rutgers University. Dr. Hamilton works as a clinical psychologist and has studied the development of depression during adolescence. Her research focuses on finding risk factors for the onset and worsening of adolescent depression and suicide. We are lucky to have her today to talk about the connection between sleep, mental health, and psychology. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Hamilton. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure our audience will too. So for my first question, can you just introduce yourself and provide some background on your work with mental health, sleep, and psychology?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So as you said, I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University. I have a PhD in clinical psychology that I received from Temple University. And I did a postdoc, which is those training after you have a PhD before you become a professor, all focused on sleep medicine. And that's really where I got focus more on research on sleep and understanding the link between sleep, depression, and suicide risk, particularly in teens, and also clinical training and treating insomnia problems in teens and adults.
Right. Okay. Can you just start off and talk about how sleep influences our mental health and overall psychological well-being?
Yeah, so sleep is probably the number one factor that is linked to our mental and physical health. And this is across development. So starting from infancy and all the way through older age. And we think about what we can do to prevent, problems with our physical health and mental health. Sleep is also the number one answer. And so when I say sleep, it's thinking about sleep problems. So difficulty falling and staying asleep, sleep duration or how much people are getting of their sleep quality or how well people think they are sleeping. And often sleep quality and some of these factors are influenced by things like waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to fall back asleep, right? Or having nightmares and things like that. So ultimately, we know that sleep, including short sleep duration, poor sleep quality, sleep problems more generally, all of those factors related to sleep are associated and predict problems for one's mental health, particularly depression, suicidal thoughts. So thinking about suicide, actual suicide behaviors such as suicide attempts. And there's even research showing that, poor sleep can affect death by suicide. So really thinking about the most critical outcomes of mental health, sleep is one of the biggest risk factors. And also can be something that we can, by improving it, can be protective as well.
Right. And I just want to ask, on the other hand, can you tell us a little bit about how mental state affects quality sleep and patterns of sleep?
Great question. I think oftentimes people do think about sleep as being a byproduct or kind of a consequence of having mental health problems. And absolutely, when we're feeling more down or sad or depressed, we're also more likely to have problems falling and staying asleep. So for instance, you might think, to relate this to someone, you're right before a big test, you might be really worried about it or big performance, you're feeling anxious at night, it's harder to fall asleep, right? So when we think about that, people who generally are having more problems with anxiety or really feeling down or depressed might also ruminate or kind of think about things a lot in their minds, which makes it harder to fall asleep. So that's one example of how, our mental state can affect our sleep. And at the same time, thinking about, we still don't know overall though, that while that relationship is true, getting good quality sleep or, reverse, getting poor sleep can actually create those problems too, of actually having more difficulty, controlling one's emotions, feeling more anxious and feeling more down or depressed as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess you could talk a little bit about your projects if you would like, but I just want to ask, how can recognizing and addressing sleep problems potentially prevent or manage mental health issues?
So ultimately, one of the big problems with sleep, right, is that most people are not getting enough. This is a broad societal problem in that people across the age span are just simply not either valuing sleep or not giving themselves the opportunities for sleep and or are don't really know necessarily the things that they can do at an individual level to actually improve their sleep. So in terms of some of the research that we're doing and thinking through these factors, one thing we're trying to do more broadly is how can we improve education around sleep? policies to improve sleep at a broader level, right? Especially for high school teens, since we know they're waking up exceptionally early in most schools. And then, actually we're waking up during what would be their biological night based on their biology. And so, ultimately thinking about what people can do to improve their sleep is one of the big goals of our research, and helping to people learning specific things. Are there certain aspects of sleep that are most closely linked to depression or suicide risk in teens? But then also, how can we better educate people about what those things are, and then again create more of a sustainable change to improve sleep overall for teens?
Yeah. And it kind of goes along with that, but like, how can individuals really break that cycle of like poor sleep and establish healthier sleep patterns? Like, especially for adolescents who like might not want to talk about it or may not even be aware of it. Like, how can we help them get better sleep?
Great question. And I think this is actually one of the things I love the most about sleep, is that most people actually relate to talking about sleep, right? You ask someone like, oh, how it like, how are you doing? And you're like, oh, I slept poorly last night.
Yeah.
Or, oh, I had a great night's sleep, so people actually are more open to talking about sleep than a lot of other mental health issues. So when we think about sleep, we often think about it as actually a gateway to helping address some of these other types of problems that people have. So, in terms of thinking about in the system of what we're working with for most people, which is, really early school start times, and having a lot of responsibilities for school, academics, and extracurriculars, I recognize that it's hard to get sleep, right? So that's the first thing I think about, recognizing that like, if this was so easy, everyone would be getting the sleep that they need.
Right.
What we can do to start to break these patterns is actually thinking a little bit more about, one, can we improve sleep education? So we'll talk maybe about some specific sleep tips. But can we actually help improve people's knowledge about what they can do to improve their sleep? And how do we actually create that behavior change? So I think there's one thing about, we sometimes think that if we just tell people what to do, they're going to do it. And if that was true, again, everyone would be getting good sleep. So we actually need to think about this both of increasing awareness to the problems and what people can actually do to improve their sleep and value its importance, and how it affects their physical and mental health. But then also, actually help people think through what they can do and what steps they actually need to take on a day-to-day basis to make those changes. So in terms of some specific tips related to your question, the most important thing, one of the things I often think about is people don't realize that stabilizing, so I'm going to break this down too, stabilizing your sleep-wake patterns is probably the number one thing we can do to actually get better sleep. So when I say stabilize our sleep-wake patterns, I'm basically saying we wake up, this is the most important part, wake up around the same time of the day, most days of the week. And so this includes even on the weekends. And typically I'm a little bit more lenient with teens because I recognize most people are waking up at, such early hours, really within an hour to maybe two max sleeping in. So thinking about for most teens, this means waking up at 6 a.m. for school. And then this would be maybe sleeping in at the latest till about 8 a.m., even on the weekends.
Right.
So why does this matter, right? So thinking like, why does it actually matter that people wake up around the same time? So one, the longer you've been awake, that actually makes it easier to be able to fall asleep at night. Your body also likes routine and rhythms, and your brain has a clock that likes to know what to expect. So when we start waking up every day, which is also influenced by light exposure, and getting that same light exposure every time of the day or around the same time of day will actually set our body's clock and help all of our body processes, digestive system, everything actually run better, including our immune system, which is very important this time of year when people are often getting sick.
Yeah. And then also like in the age of smartphones and screens, like how can people manage their technology use to safeguard both their sleep and mental health?
So that's the other side of the best parts of the tips, right? Is having a stable wake up time and like a rise up routine, we call it, but also having a wind down routine. Oftentimes people are up on their smartphones or their laptops, essentially working up until, or, socializing up until the time they want to go to bed. So they put their phone down and are like, okay, now sleep. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that, right? Our bodies and our brains actually need a little bit of time to kind of switch gears and relax and slow things down to be able to fall asleep. And so when we're on our smartphones and screens, or even in bright lights more broadly, but most people are in bright lights and on their smartphones or on their computers up until the time they want to go to sleep. That means that it's going to, one, affect their actual body's hormones of readiness for sleep, because light exposure affects melatonin, which is a hormone of darkness. So if you're in a bright light space, including screens, it's harder to have that it suppresses that melatonin. The other aspect of it is that when we're doing these things, our brain is still working really hard, right? It's socializing, it's activated, or it's working hard on school. And so it's ultimately all of those things make it harder. So what can we do? We can actually stop doing those things right up until bedtime. I would say at a minimum, honestly, being more flexible, recognizing that this is already a challenging thing to do, like 20 minutes, 30 minutes before you go to sleep, putting those smartphones away, and actually starting to engage in a wind down routine. So what might that be, right? Maybe it's brushing your teeth, washing your face, shutting the overhead lights on, reading a book or listening to a podcast. So yes, maybe, and when I say reading a book, I'm thinking like an actual physical book.
Okay.
um, those old school things, but also it's really that will kind of help also over time. If you build that routine, your body and your brain start to actually be like, oh, okay, this means it's starting to get ready for sleep. So you're slowing things down and then actually being able to probably fall asleep a little bit more quickly and have better quality of sleep when you do fall asleep.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And you kind of touched base on this, but can you just provide a few more like actionable strategies people can use to promote like good sleep hygiene in a positive mental health space?
Absolutely. So I think one is thinking through, right? Coming up with a wind down routine. So what can you do? And actually maybe even setting like concrete reminders for yourself. And that can include your phone, right? We can use technology to help remind us about this. So we can set a reminder, okay, maybe around 10 o'clock, that's when I'm going to shut my phone off or shut my computer off and stop doing whatever I need to be doing. And then start my wind down routine, which might, again, include those different things. So actually coming up with a plan of what does it actually look like for you as a person? And then kind of similarly, waking up around the same time of day. And that can be really hard on the weekend. So thinking through what are those barriers that might get in the way? For me, I'm tired, right? You're tired, you're exhausted, you don't want to get out of bed. Right now it's so cold outside, it feels nice and cozy. So actually setting your phone away somewhere. So if that's what you're using as an alarm, different tip, but ideally setting an alarm clock, somewhere farther out of arm's reach where you actually have to physically get out of bed is one way to help get yourself, or schedule something fun earlier in the morning so that you have to get out of bed by a specific time. Those are ways to help get yourself out of sleep. Stopping smartphone use and screen time and just general, socializing or computer time about 20 to 30 minutes before you want to go to sleep. The other thing, and this is for people who are really struggling with falling and staying asleep, we often think that if we get into bed and we lie there, the longer we lie there awake, trying to fall asleep, we're eventually going to just fall asleep. And sure, that's true maybe to a point where eventually you might ultimately fall asleep. But what ends up happening is we end up then creating this cycle where we get into bed and our body actually starts reacting to our bed as a place that creates stress. So
Right.
what happens when you're facing a stressor, right? Well, your heart rate is racing. You're getting ready for that fight or flight system, right? Your adrenaline starts moving. Ultimately, that's in contrast to what you want when you're trying to fall asleep, which is more
Yeah.
dominated by the other part of your body, your parasympathetic nervous system or rest and digest system. So big picture, ultimately, if you're in your bed and you can't fall asleep for about 30 minutes or more, actually getting out of bed and going to another spot in your room or another spot in your house, if you have those options, being somewhere in low light, doing something distracting and relaxing, again, off screens, held close to your face. It's actually something people can do to start to ultimately retrain their brains that, okay, my bed is for sleep. Same thing for waking up in the middle of the night and tossing and turning for hours, actually getting out of bed after about 20, 30 minutes if you feel like you're not starting to fall asleep. And then, doing something distracting, relaxing, and in low light, and then being able to shift back into sleep. As soon as you're starting to feel sleepy and ready for sleep, going back into the bed, that will over time start to retrain your brain that, okay, my bed is for sleep.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes people with insomnia or people who have trouble sleeping, falling or staying asleep will say that it feels like their bed is the enemy. And
Right.
they'll be able to actually fall asleep in other places much more quickly. And that's because of that association that our brain has created. So
Yeah.
that's another thing people don't realize can actually help better cement and stabilize their sleep and get better quality sleep.
Yeah. So really making sure that the connection is between like bed and sleep instead of like anything else.
Yeah, and actually, great you just brought it up. Eliminating or reducing a lot of the other activities we tend to do in our beds, like homework. So if you're doing things that are stressful or activating and kind of like stimulating for your brain or your body, those kinds of things again will help create that association that bed is not for sleep. So trying to not do homework in your bed or play video games and other things while in your bed is another recommendation that would help with that association.
Right. Yeah. And then along with that, like when should someone consider really seeking like professional help for like a sleep related issue, maybe like insomnia or like, and how can they find like the right resources for that?
Great question. And so this is where I do think that some of these behavioral strategies can help someone who is maybe starting to struggle with sleep and think through what things that they can do to improve their sleep. But also if you're not able to fall and stay asleep, and that's happening for more days in the week than it's not happening. So usually I would say like, from a clinical sense, 3 or more days a week, and you're having trouble falling and staying asleep for like 30 minutes or more every night or most of those nights, and that's happening for a period of time. So let's say 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. That's actually meeting that what we would call insomnia disorder. And most important to those things is if that's the case, you're actually it's probably getting in the way of things in your life. And so that's what we call impairment, right? It's getting in the way of things for you, whether it's school, sports, friends, relationships, because what happens when we're sleep deprived? We're cranky, we're irritable, we can't perform as well, we can't focus, all of those things. So if sleep problems are getting in the way for you of being able to focus in school, perform well, interact with your peers, socialize with them, also get along with your family, that's essentially impairment, right? It's getting in the way of things for you. And that's really when it's important to seek professional care. There are sleep doctors. So we say sleep doctors. There are actually people who are trained in the best interventions for sleep. And that is a behavioral sleep medicine specialist, or a sleep clinic. And there are a bunch actually in the New Jersey area. So we're in a resource rich area, we say, because there's a lot of these really great centers that are around that help specifically treat sleep problems. So when I say the best treatment, it's actually not medicine. The best treatment for sleep problems and specifically for insomnia disorder based on research is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. There's some apps that can help with this that are online. Sleepio, Sleepio is one app. I think it might cost like $4 on your app, but it actually has CBTI and it's been shown to be effective. So that's a more accessible treatment. But also, of course, if it's important to get professional help and see someone to actually, get an assessment, get professional advice, and they likely will be recommending and working with you on CBTI, which is really important. And from experience, having done this, it is one of the quickest and most effective treatments I've ever done from a psychological treatment perspective.
Yeah. And can you just briefly explain what CBTI really is to everyone?
Yeah, so CBTI is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So really what it means is it's focusing on the thoughts, behaviors that are getting in the way of sleep and specifically creating insomnia problems or difficulty falling or staying asleep. It can include, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks of treatment, which is actually fairly short, right? So 4 to 6 weeks, meaning that like in 6 weeks, your insomnia could be significantly improved. Typically from the traditional standpoint, if you're meeting with someone in person, it would be 1 hour outpatient therapy. So you'd go once a week to meet with the person who would be doing CBTI with you. The first session would just be learning more about sleep. And some of the tips that I mentioned, they would get into as well, but provide a little bit more of the science behind it, which I think can help people understand, okay, this is why napping doesn't help me, right? I think napping helps me, but actually this is me from a scientific perspective. This is how it doesn't based on my body. And so learning some of those tips at an earlier standpoint would be like session 1. The next sessions would focus on some of those behavioral strategies and actually implementing them and troubleshooting when they're not working or not going well. And then also focusing on some of the thoughts. So that's the cognitive part. One of the biggest problems when people are struggling with insomnia is they wake up, they look at the clock, right? There's this idea of, oh no, I'm not getting the sleep I need. And then that's actually creating stress and anxiety and frustration as well. And that's fueling the cycle of insomnia. So one of the things we'd also do would be address what some of those thoughts are and help create more strategies to manage those thoughts, to help improve sleep as well. And it is very effective treatment. So
Yeah.
also brief behavioral treatment for insomnia, BBTI, is actually a 1 session in-person treatment focused more on the behavioral components. And that's also extremely effective. So sometimes people will start with the 1 dose of treatment and then actually move into CBTI as well. depending on what the problems are and the best approach, right? So that's actually where sleep is really treatable. Like sleep problems, I should say, are really treatable. And I hope that that's one of the big takeaways that people learn.
Yeah. And I guess what is like one last thing you want to let our audience of maybe like adolescents and teens to take away in terms of mental health and sleep?
So if I were to say to you that I have a magic pill that would make you feel really good every day, perform your best at school, at sports, with your friends, and ultimately actually help you live a longer life, would you take that magic pill?
With no, like I would definitely take it in a second. Yeah.
So what if I told you that magic pill is actually getting good quality sleep,
I wouldn't,
right?
yeah, I wouldn't be that surprised.
Yeah. And so ultimately, I think if we actually think about it like that, that actually getting the sleep that we need every night, which is at least 8 hours of sleep at the right amount of time. So going to sleep and waking up around the same time every day, getting good quality sleep, that is that magic pill. And so if we start to think about it like that, we can actively both feel better, perform better, and as I said, based on research of what we know about sleep, actually live longer and healthier lives. So I hope that that's the takeaway that people think about is sleep is that magic pill.
Yeah. All right. I think those are all my questions for today. Again, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time and the information you gave.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into the Reward Podcast. Before you go, we'd appreciate your support by subscribing, liking, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for our next podcast, where we will be joined by a special guest speaker to explore even more about the fascinating world of sleep and psychology.